What's up, guys? My name is Marcus Huskins, and thank you for joining me. As always, if you're finding this content useful, please go ahead, do me a favor, and hit that subscribe button, and I appreciate your support. Okay, so moving right along, I wanted to take a moment to talk about working with VCAs, and I'm going to split this video up into as many different parts as needed so that these are not too long and they're easy to digest. But let's go ahead and take a look at a cue that I'm working with here. I've got everything pulled in at unity gain. This is the exact way that it was received by the composer. Let's do a data zoom just so we can see our waveforms a little bit better. Now, I want to talk about the way that I like to set a mix up, really regardless of what type of mix it is. I always like to do a couple different things. So one thing that I will do is I will color code my tracks and my audio events based on the groups that I see them belonging to. Now, I don't have a specific color structure that I always stick to, but one thing that I do like to do is I like to make sure that there's different shades of color that are sitting beside each other. And this isn't so much for Studio One. This is more to do with when working with, for example, a controller, like in my case, the Fader Port 16. These different blocks of colors really stick out to me when I look at the select buttons on the Fader Port. Now, also, I'm going to do something a little bit differently than I usually do in that I'm actually going to be working with the Fader Port 16 for the duration of this video for adjusting my mix. I usually like to work just with my mouse and keyboard, but this one we're going to do a little bit differently. So the whole purpose is incorporating working with VCAs into your workflow. We can go ahead and play this, and this is everything brought in at unity gain, and it's going to sound pretty complete. Let's go ahead and just play from, maybe we'll play from this section over here. Okay, so you get the idea. Now what I want to do is I'm actually going to engage my remote, and let's pull down all of these faders over here. And I'm doing this on the fader port. So if you're seeing these faders move on your screen, that's the reason. So the first thing I do is let's start building our mix, and I'm just going to start pushing these faders up. Okay, so there's my kick. Okay, we'll start pushing up our percussion. Our bass, Celeste, okay, we'll move on to our strings, and I'm going to start over here. Okay, so I've really quickly put a static mix up together, and one thing that I like to do when I'm putting my static mix together is, unless I really need to, like I could, for example, solo out all of these tracks together, so I'm listening to them in isolation, and just make sure that that blend is a good blend, but I find it's much easier, and I get a better result in the long run if I build the entire static mix whilst listening to everything. Okay, so that is the first step that I take. Now, the immediate next step that I take is that I will create VCAs for all of my different groups. Now, I'm going to click my wrench icon, and this is not something that I usually keep on by default, but I'm sure that this is the way that Studio One does things by default, and it's not a bad behavior. I would just prefer to have my VCAs closer to my tracks, but let's make sure that we have keep VCAs to the right enabled. Now we can right click, and it's just add VCA for selected channels. Okay, so now you see we have this VCA that's at the very back end of the track. Let's go ahead and create all of our VCAs first, and I've got a shortcut here, but I'm just going to do this with my mouse so that you guys are seeing it exactly the way as it is in the default state of Studio One. Okay, now I'm going to select this one. Okay, so now we have these tracks. Let me use my fader port, move back to the beginning. You'll note that at the bottom here, we have the VCA connection. If you're not seeing that, you can click this wrench icon, and this will show you where the VCA connections are. Now, a couple things I want to point out about VCAs. First of all, once you get used to working with VCAs, it is really useful, and it's almost next to impossible to revert back to not having them. So I'm going to scroll over to the VCAs in my song over here, And you'll notice that, for example, if we take a look at the VCA fader that's connected to the string section, and I'm just going to bring that into focus on my fader port, here's a couple things I can do. First of all, I can solo just the VCA, and now it's soloing all of the elements that are part of that group. Conversely, I could also mute the VCA. So I could mute VCA 5, VCA 4. This is allowing me to work in a way that this one VCA folder, or fader rather, is connected to a bunch of tracks. Let me just reset this back to unity gain over here. Now, another thing that you can do, and it's pretty good behavior to get used to, is that unless you are okay with this, like for example, VCA 1, VCA 2, 3, 4, 5, I always like to name my VCAs. So if we come over here, we can just double click and I can name my VCA. So this one will be drums. I'm going to use a tab key, and I use short forms where I can. So this one will be perk, and the next one is going to be bass, and I'm just tabbing over. Even though the bass and the Celeste are only one track, I'm giving them their own VCA, because what I like to do is do all of my mixing directly from the VCAs to kind of fine tune my mix after I've done a basic static mix. Okay, so next we're going to do, I'm going to type in winds, and then last but not least, I'm going to type in strings. Okay, so now I have these VCAs that I've named, and you'll note that if we take a look, let me go back to the very beginning, all of the names that are associated with the VCA is now available in the bottom of this VCA connections. Now, if I go back to the end here, I can choose any one of these, and I'm doing this through my fader port. And like I said, we know we can mute and we know we can solo. And the other really cool thing is that the VCAs will control the level of these tracks. So for example, if I grab the strings VCA and I start moving this up or down, you'll see that it's controlling the level of all of my strings over here. Now, the interesting thing is that the relative balance that we set in our static mix, that is still the same. And the other thing to note is that if I had automation on any one of these tracks in particular, that I could leave that automation intact and I could essentially offset the level by using the VCA fader. So just to kind of prove this point, let's open up the track-based automation view on this track. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And in fact, we can just come in here and I'm going to enter touch mode. And I'm going to make sure that I'm selecting this track. And let's just write some automation here. So I just wrote some automation, and we can zoom in by seeing that over here. Maybe we'll choose a slightly different color, perhaps something like, there we go. That's nice and visible. So I've written this automation, and now I can put this track in read mode. So what happens when you have tracks that have automation and they're in a specific mode is if I was to play this, as soon as it starts to pass through, the automation is going to be read, and that's going to move. Now, if I attempted to make any move on this track, like for example, this is set to -5. If I said, okay, I want to pull this down to like -9, the minute I press play, that's jumping back up to -5. But when you have a VCA that's connected, I can essentially offset this information or offset that level using my VCA fader. So check this out. I'm going to press play. I've turned up the overall level, or I can turn it down. And you can kind of see what's happening here with this gray information that's in the background. This is showing you basically what the offset is doing. Okay, so let's stop the transport for a moment, and I'm going to command click to reset this. And in fact, I'm also going to get rid of this automation, and let's take this track and let's turn its read mode off. So now that we have our mix set up with VCAs, essentially, if we're happy with this, now I can actually fine tune all of my levels using just the VCAs. So on my fader port, I'm going to click the VCA button, and this is going to pull me into a VCA view where I only have those 6 VCA faders in front of me. And I can smooth out these levels and do anything that I need to do. So for example, I'm going to move to, let me just reset my zoom over here. Let's go to the markers and move back to this section. It's a good section where everything's plain. So now, and let me just scroll over my console view a little bit so you see these VCAs. I'm now using my VCAs, and I can set my mix. So for example, I could rebuild my whole entire mix, right? Let's start with our drums, and then maybe I want to bring up my bass. I want to bring my percussion. Okay, we'll bring in our Celeste. My winds and my strings. So the other cool thing is that these also behave the same way we would expect, in that if I select multiple faders, I can move these all as a group, and I can move them all up and down relative to each other. So this is great for getting our gain staging right. So for example, let me just hop into my effects. And if I scroll over to my favorites, I always like to drag a VU meter in. I can set my scale to either 18 or 12, adjust my sensitivity, and then based on these VCA faders, I can essentially gain stage my whole mix. Let's expand this. Bring it down. Whoops, I lost my selection there. I can bring it in. Okay, so let's say that I'm happy with that as the starting point of my mix. The idea here is that you want to make things simple. And I don't only have to control a VCA for an audio track. If I had chosen to make subgroups of all of these tracks over here, instead of choosing to put a VCA to the main audio channels, I could have controlled all the bus channels. So I could have made a subgroup for drums, a subgroup for percussion, a subgroup for bass, a subgroup for Celeste, a subgroup for my woodwinds, and then a subgroup for my strings. And I could have connected those VCAs to the subgroups instead of connecting them to the source channels. And in fact, what I usually do is I will have VCAs across multiple stages of my song to control my gain staging and simplify my mixing. So this is the first video. I think we'll leave it off here, and I would definitely recommend giving it a try in terms of trying to use or trying out the way the workflow is when using VCAs. It's a really awesome way to be able to gain stage your mix. It's an awesome way to be able to work. And the other thing is, even if you have, for example, automation that's tied to a track, you could still attach a VCA and adjust the relative level of a fader. In addition to that, if I wanted to readjust my mix by soloing out these different elements, I could say, okay, I want to bring my hi-hats up a little bit. And I'm doing this with a mouse now, by the way. I can still adjust these source tracks, and that's not affecting the VCAs. Now the VCAs downstream, again, we can solo out these different elements like this. So it's just really an additional layer of control in terms of taking control of your mix. All right, so that's all the time I have available in this video. Again, if you enjoyed this, please consider hitting that subscribe button. Any questions or comments, please leave them down below. I will do my best to get back to you. And as always, we will catch you in the next video. Cheers.